Well, here we are back for part 2 of our presentations on lenses. In this time, we're going to talk about using lenses to control both perspective and, along with that, spatial relationships. It's important that you understand this material that's in this presentation is also in the handout that's online that you can print and have to review. But I'm hoping, because I think this is so important, I'm hoping that between the two, you'll come out with a pretty good understanding of what's going on here. So let's get this rolling. Linear perspective is a topic that deals with how objects relate to each other as they're closer or farther from the observer. It's pretty common if you've been through any kind of art class in high school, junior high, probably even in grade school. They talked about perspective, and you got to see 1-point, 2-point perspective, and you got to draw it and do all of those things. What you learned pretty quickly was that objects that are the same size in reality appear smaller the farther they are from the observer, and also that parallel lines that are running away from the observer appear to get closer the farther away they are. And the usual example was of railroad tracks and parallel lines meeting in infinity and all of that stuff. Well, this is pretty much old stuff, and we see it every day. We learn the language of perspective, and it gives us part of our sense of three-dimensional space. When it comes to lenses, we have some interesting controls. Normally, and we saw this in the first presentation, it's convenient to use different angles of view for the different focal lengths to avoid physically having to actually walk backwards or forward in order to best crop our subject. And so we use those lenses, especially a zoom lens, simply as an incredibly expensive cropping tool. The problem is there are far better ways to use them, and there are more important ways to use them that are going to have an effect on composition. In fact, by both changing the lens focal length and at the same time changing the camera to subject distance, moving closer or further away, you can change the apparent size and spatial relationships of subjects in your photograph. And here's a diagram we can use to illustrate that point. A little drawing that I made some time ago showing both a telephoto lens and a wide-angle lens and how they are photographing these two objects. What's important is that the two objects, were they real, the house and the mountain, regardless of what lens they're being shot with, actually never change size, and they never change their distance from one another. The only thing that changes is the camera position. The house, in this case for illustration purposes, is kept at the same size and height on the image plane, and that leads us to some interesting results. Remember, the only change is focal distance and focal length of the lens. So let's look at this telephoto side for a moment. In the telephoto shot, taken from farther away, the house is lined up with the center of the frame, meaning the top of the house is pretty much right at the center of the frame that we're looking at. But due to the angle of view of that long lens, the mountains appear to rise up behind it, kind of loom over it, and consequently, that background environment takes on a much greater visual importance. It's sometimes referred to as the telephoto effect, the way those relationships are defined. But if we go the other way, if we go to the wide angle, now we've moved in closer in order to keep the house the same size and lined up the same way it was with the telephoto shot. But now the background shrinks away and looks farther away while the house appears to be larger. You can see from the drawn angles of these two lenses why this happens. With the telephoto shot, even though the house lines up with the center, the top of the mountains is right at the top of that angle of view. But in the wide-angle shot, the house is still in the center, or still lines up with the center, but the mountain is now a long way from the top of the frame for that view. What happens with the wide-angle shot is it's the foreground that becomes more visually prominent and important than the background, which has shrunk away. So we're going to take a look at this in real life. I have to give you a quick little note about the shots that you're about to see. You've already seen them twice, potentially. You'll have seen them in the handout that I put online, and you'll have seen them in the welcoming video. But now we'll really take a look at them and see how things are changing. When I shot these, there was a series of little rain showers going through, and I kept running back and forth from the car to the position to take the picture. And that's why there's a change in lighting as the sun comes in and out of the clouds, and on the amount of water on the parking lot where I was parked. Here's our first shot. 17 millimeters taken from almost right on top of the car. We're that close. And note what happens. The vehicle, of course, is distorted. You would expect that with such an ultra-wide-angle lens. But the city is way back there on the horizon. You can just barely see it at this focal length of a lens. Here, we've moved back just a little bit. We have a 40 millimeter lens. This is the normal range. The distortion is lessened, although there still is some. And the city, it's a little bit larger, but not by much. Mostly what we've done is gotten rid of the distortion. But now when we move back to an 85 millimeter lens, now things are just starting to change. We have lost the distortion. This is a perfect lens for that. But the city in the background is becoming quite distinct. You can see it. It's larger. It looks a little closer, actually. So let's bump this up a little more. Here is a 150 millimeter lens. Wow, now the city is starting to move. Now we can start to see it climbing up behind the vehicle, and it's getting closer, or apparently closer. So let's jump another leap. Here's a 250 millimeter lens. Now things really are starting to take over. You can see that the city is now just looming over the car. And the body of water that's separating, which is actually across the big bay in San Diego, is getting smaller and smaller. And if we bump this all the way to 400 millimeters, now the city is huge, and the water could be a small river flowing through San Diego instead of that big bay. It's made a huge difference. So what have we learned from all of this? Well, for one thing, we've learned that various focal length lenses and good zoom lenses are for far more than simple cropping tools. In fact, if we change both the focal length and the focal distance, we can alter the apparent size relationships of objects that exist in the three-dimensional space out in front of our camera. So we can have a huge effect on perspective. We've learned that wide-angle or short focal length lenses emphasize the foreground objects and diminish the background elements, while if we switch to a telephoto lens and get the telephoto effect, they diminish the foreground objects relative to the background, which is enlarged, and the distance between foreground and background is compressed. So with all of this, we have an amazing amount of control. If you have multiple lenses or you have a zoom lens, go out and try it for yourself. Keep a main subject the same size in your viewfinder as you move closer or further away, changing the focal length of your lens with each shot. See how it works for you. So with that, if you've got some questions, feel free to email them to me, and we'll get back to the main learning module now.